once again. It's me, and it's time for the end of chapter 1, and I'm going to go on to chapter 2, I think, tonight. So we are kind of in the middle of the page in chapter 2, so I will read, I think, the last sentence or two, just so we know where we are. So here we go. Yes, he said without hesitation, I promise you, much afraid, that when the plant of love is ready to bloom in your heart, and when you are ready to change your name, then you will be loved in return. A thrill of joy went through her from head to foot. It seemed too wonderful to be believed, but the shepherd himself was making the promise, and of one thing she was quite sure. He could not lie. Please plant love in my heart now, she said faintly. Poor little soul, she was still much afraid, even when promised the greatest thing in the world. The shepherd put his hand in his bosom, drew something forth, and laid it in the palm of his hand. Then he held his hand out toward Much Afraid. Here is the seed of love, he said. She bent forward to look, then gave a startled little cry and drew back. There was indeed a seed lying in the palm of his hand, but it was shaped exactly like a long, sharply pointed thorn. Much Afraid had often noticed that the shepherd's hands were scarred and wounded, but now she saw that the scar in the palm of her hand held out to her was the exact shape and size of the seed of love lying beside it. The seed looks very sharp, she said shrinkingly. Won't it hurt if I put it in my heart? He answered gently. It is so sharp that it slips in very quickly. But Much Afraid, I have already warned you that love and pain go together, for a time at least. If you would know love, you must know pain too. Much Afraid looked at the thorn and shrank from it. Then she looked at the shepherd's face and repeated his words to herself. When the seed of love in your heart is ready to bloom, you will be loved in return. And a strange new courage entered into her. She suddenly stepped forward, bared her heart, and said, Please plant the seed here in my heart. His face lit up with a glad smile, and he said, with a note of joy in his voice, Now you will be able to go with me to the high places and be a citizen in the kingdom of my Father. Then he pressed the thorn into her heart. It was true, just as he had said. It did cause a piercing pain, but it slipped in quickly, and then, suddenly, a sweetness she had never felt or imagined before tingled through her. It was bittersweet, but the sweetness was stronger. She thought of the shepherd's words, It is so happy to love. And her pale, sallow cheeks suddenly glowed pink, and her eyes shone. For a moment, Much Afraid did not look afraid at all. The twisted mouth had relaxed into a happy curve, and the shining eyes and pink cheeks made her almost beautiful. Thank you, she cried, and knelt at the shepherd's feet. How good you are, how patient you are. There is no one in the whole world as good and kind as you. I will go with you to the mountains. I will trust you to make my feet like Hind's feet, and to set me, even me, upon the high places." "I am more glad even than you," said the shepherd. "And now you really act as though you are going to change your name already. But there is one thing more I must tell you. I shall take you to the foot of the mountains myself, so that there will be no danger from your enemies. After that, 2 special companions I have chosen will guide and help you on all the steep and difficult places while your feet are still lame and while you can only limp and go slowly. You will not see me all the time, much afraid, for, as I told you, I shall be leaping on the mountains and skipping on the hills, and you will not at first be able to accompany me or keep up with me. That will come later. However, you must remember that as soon as you reach the slopes of the mountains, there is a wonderful system of communication from end to end in the kingdom of love, and I shall be able to hear you whenever you speak to me. Whenever you call for help, I promise to come to you at once. At the foot of the mountains, my 2 servants, whom I have chosen to be your guides, will be waiting for you. Remember, I have chosen them myself with great care as the 2 who are most able to help you and assist you in developing Hind's feet. You will accept them with joy and allow them to be your helpers, will you not?" "Oh, yes," she answered at once, smiling at him happily. "Of course, I am quite certain that you know best, and that whatever you choose is right." Then she added joyfully, "I feel as though I shall never be afraid again." He looked very kindly at the little shepherdess, who had just received the seed of love into her heart and was preparing to go with him to the high places, but also with full understanding. He knew her through and through, in all the intricate labyrinth of her lonely heart, better far than she knew herself. No one understood better than he that growing into the likeness of a new name is a long process. But he did not say this. He looked with a certain tender pity and compassion at the glowing cheeks and shining eyes which had so suddenly transformed the appearance of plain little Much Afraid. Then he said, "Now you may go home and make your preparations for leaving. You are not to take anything with you, only leave everything in order. Do not tell anyone about it, for a journey to the high places needs to be a secret matter. I cannot now give you the exact time when we are to start for the mountains, but it will be soon, and you must be ready to follow me whenever I come to the cottage and call. I will give you a secret sign. I shall sing one of the shepherd's songs as I pass the cottage, and it will contain a special message for you. When you hear it, come at once and follow me to the trysting place." Then, as the sun had already gone down in the blaze of red and gold, and the eastern mountains were now veiled in misty mauve and gray, and the shadows were lengthening, he turned and led his flock away toward the sheepfolds. Much Afraid turned her face homeward, her heart full of happiness and excitement, and still feeling as though she would never be frightened again. As she started back across the field, she sang to herself one of the songs from an old book of songs which the shepherds often used. Never before had it seemed to her so sweet, so applicable. The song of songs, the loveliest song, the song of love the king. No joy on earth compares with his, but seems a broken thing. His name as ointment is poured forth, and all his lovers sing. Draw me, I will run after thee, thou art my heart's one choice. O bring me to thy royal house, to dwell there and rejoice. There in my presence, O King, to feast and hear thy voice. Look not upon me with contempt, though soiled and marred I be. The King found me, an outcast thing, and set his love on me. I shall be perfected by love, made fair as day to see. Song of Songs, chapter 1, verses 1 through 6. She walked singing across the first field and was halfway over the next when suddenly she saw Craven Fear himself coming toward her. Poor Much Afraid! For a little while she had completely forgotten the existence of her dreadful relatives, and now here was the most dreaded and detested of them all slouching toward her. Her heart filled with a terrible panic. She looked right and left, but there was no hiding place anywhere, and besides, it was all too obvious that he was actually coming to meet her. For as soon as he saw her, he quickened his pace, and in a moment or two was right beside her. With a horror that sickened her very heart, she heard him say, "Well, here you are at last, little cousin Much Afraid. So we are to be married, eh? What do you think of that?" And he pinched her, presumable in a playful manner, but viciously enough to make her gasp and bite her lips to keep back a cry of pain. She shrank away from him and shook with terror and loathing. Unfortunately, this was the worst thing she could have done, for it was always her obvious fear which encouraged him to continue tormenting her. If only she could have ignored him, he soon would have tired of teasing and of her company and would have wandered off to look for other prey. In all her life, however, Much Afraid had never been able to ignore fear. Now, it was absolutely beyond her power to conceal the dread which she felt. Her white face and terrified eyes immediately had the effect of stimulating Craven's desire to bait her. Here she was, alone and completely in his power. He caught hold of her, and poor Much Afraid uttered one frenzied cry of terror and pain. At that moment Craven Fear loosed his grasp and cringed away. The shepherd had approached them unperceived and was standing beside them. One look at his stern face and flashing eyes and the stout shepherd's cudgel grasped in his strong, uplifted hand was more than enough for the bully. Craven Fear slunk away like a whipped cur, actually running from the village instead of toward it, not knowing where he was going, urged by one instinct alone, to find a place of safety. Much Afraid burst into tears. Of course she ought to have known that Craven was a coward, and that if only she had lifted her voice and called for the shepherd, he would have fled at once. Now her dress was torn and disordered, and her arms bruised by the bully's grip. Yet that was the least part of her distress. She was overwhelmed with shame that she had so quickly acted like her old name and nature, which she had hoped was beginning to be changed already. It seemed so impossible to ignore the fearings, still less to resist them. She did not dare look at the shepherd, but had she done so, she would have seen with what compassion he was regarding her. she did not realize that the Prince of Love is of very tender compassion to them that are afraid. She supposed that, like everybody else, he was despising her for her silly fears, so she muttered ashamed, "Thank you." Then, still without looking at him, she limped painfully toward the village, weeping bitterly as she went, and saying over and over again to herself, "What is the use of even thinking of going to the high places? I could never reach them, for the least little thing is enough to turn me back." However, when at last she reached the security of the cottage, she began to feel better, and by the time she had drunk a cup of tea and taken her evening meal, she had recovered so far that she was able to remind herself of all that had happened there beside the cascade and the pool. Suddenly, she remembered with a thrill of wonder and delight that the seed of love had been planted in her heart. As she thought of it, the same almost intolerable sweetness stole over her, the bitter-sweet, indefinable, but wholly delightful ecstasy of a new happiness. "It is happy to love," said Little Much Afraid to herself, and then she repeated, "It is happy to love." After putting the cottage in order for the night, because she was utterly tired out with all the conflicting emotions of that strange day, she went to bed. Lying there before falling asleep, she sang over and over again to herself another of the lovely songs from the old song-book. "O thou whom my soul loveth, tell me where thou dost feed, and where thy flocks at noonday to rest and browse dost lead. For why should I by other be, and not by thee? O fairest among women, dost thou indeed not know? Then lead thy little flocklet the way that my flocks go, and be to me, as I to thee, sweet company." Song of Songs, chapter 1, verses 7 through 8. Then she fell into a heavy, dreamless sleep. And so we will begin with chapter 2, Fearing Invasion. Okay. Much Afraid woke early the next morning, and all her fears were gone. Her first thought was, probably sometime today I'm to start for the high places with the shepherd. This so excited her that she could hardly eat her breakfast, and as she began making arrangements for her departure, she could not help singing. It seemed to her that ever since the seed of love had been planted in her heart, songs of joy were welling up in her innermost being, and the songs which best expressed this new happiness and thankfulness were from the old book, which the shepherds so loved to use as they worked among the flocks and led them to the pastures. As she carried out the simple arrangements the shepherd had told her to make, she sang another of these songs. "Now when the king at table sits, my spikenard smelleth sweet, and myrrh and camphor from my store I pour upon his feet. My thankful love must be displayed. He loved and wooed a beggar maid. Ye daughters of Jerusalem, I'm black to look upon, as goat skin tints, but also as the tint of Solomon. Without I bear the marks of sin, but love's adorning is within. Despise me not that I am black, the sun hath burned my face. My mother's children hated me, and drove me from my place. In their vineyards I toiled and wept, but mine own vineyard have not kept. I am not fair, save to the king. Though fair my royal dress, his kingly grace is lavished on my need and worthlessness. My blemishes he will not see, but loves the beauty that shall be. Song of Songs, chapter 1, verses 12 through 15, and verses 5 through 6. From time to time, as she went about her work, her heart fluttered, half with excitement, half with dread of the unknown. But whenever she remembered the thorn in her heart, she tingled from head to foot with the same mysterious sweetness. Love was for her, too, even for her, crippled little Much Afraid. When she reached the high places, she was to lose her humiliating disfigurements and be made beautiful. And when the plant in her heart was ready to bloom, she was to be loved in return. Even as she thought of this, doubt mingled with the sweetness. Surely it could not possibly be true. Just a beautiful dream, but not a reality. Oh, I'm afraid it won't ever happen, she would say to herself. And then, when she thought of the shepherd, her heart quickened again, and she would run to the door or window to see if he were coming to call her. The morning wore on, and still he had not come. But just after midday something else came. An invasion by her terrible relatives. All of a sudden, before she realized what was happening, they were upon her. There was tramping of feet and a clamor of voices, and then she was surrounded by a whole army of aunts and uncles and cousins. Craven, however, was not with them. The family, hearing of his reception the evening before, and realizing that she shrank from him with peculiar dread and terror, had decided that it would not be wise to take him with them. They were determined to overrule Much Afraid's objections to the marriage, and, if possible, get her out of the cottage and into one of their own dwelling places. Their plan was to make a bold attack, while she would be alone in the cottage and the shepherd far away with his flocks, so they hoped she would be at their mercy. She could not be forcibly abducted in broad daylight. There were too many of the shepherd's servants in the village who would instantly come to her assistance. However, they knew Much Afraid's timidity and weakness, and they believed that, if there were enough of them present, they could cow her into consenting to go with them to the mansion of old Lord Fearing. Then they would have her in their power. The old lord himself was actually with them, assuring her in a fatherly tone of voice that they had come with the kindest and friendliest intentions. He understood that she had some objections to the proposed marriage, and he wanted to have the opportunity of quietly talking them over with her, to see if he could set them at rest. It seemed to him that it was a suitable and attractive match in every way, and that there must be some extraordinary misconception in her mind, with a little understanding talked together, would set right. If not, he assured her kindly he would not permit her to be married against her will. When he had finished, a babble of other fearing voices broke in, reasoning with her and making all sorts of suggestions. The fact was, they told her, that she had cut herself off from her relatives for so long, it was now quite apparent that she had all kinds of strange notions about their feelings and intentions toward her. It was really only right that she should now spend a little time with them, and thus give them the opportunity of proving that she had misjudged and misunderstood them. Craven might not be just as handsome and pleasing in appearance as a prince in a fairy tale, and it was true that he had, unfortunately, rather a rough manner. But that was because he had known nothing of the softening and refining influences of marriage. Certainly the responsibilities and joys of married life would quickly alter this, and would indeed effect a transformation in him. It was to be her delightful privilege to assist as principal mover in bringing about this reformation which they all so eagerly wished to see. The whole gang talked on and on, while poor Much Afraid sat cowering in their midst, almost too dazed to know what they were saying, and suggesting, just as they had hoped, they were gradually bringing her to a state of bewilderment and incoherent fear. It looked as though they would soon be able to persuade her that it was her duty to attempt the impossible task of trying to convert craven fear into something less objectionable than he really was. Suddenly, there came an interruption from without, and I shall stop here for the evening. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May he make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord lift up his countenance upon you and grant you peace. Until next time, bye.